Hello students. In the previous class, we discussed on the meaning of demand, its determinants, law of demand, its assumptions, and its features. In this class, let's look into the illustration of law of demand through a demand schedule and demand curve. In traditional economics, the price quantity relationship is shown arithmetically in the form of a table showing price and price corresponding quantities. Demand schedule explains different quantities of a commodity that will be demanded at a particular time in a particular market at different prices. The response of amount demanded to changes in the price of a commodity is known as a demand schedule. It simply summarizes the information on prices and quantities demanded. Now, here a demand schedule of an individual consumer is given. The table that you see here shows the demand schedule of an individual consumer. So here we have made two columns, namely price and quantity demanded. Just look at the table. What do you see? When the prices change, the quantity demanded also changes. What's happening to the prices? We see the prices are decreasing. What's happening to the quantity demanded? It is increasing. At rupees 20, the quantity demanded is 1 unit. At price rupees 18, the quantity demanded is 2 units. At price 16, it is 3 units, 14, 4 units, 12, 5 units. So this schedule shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So what kind of relationship do we see between the price and the quantity demanded? When the prices change, the demand also change. When the prices decrease, the quantity demanded increases. So we see there is a negative relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. So this table represents the demand schedule of an individual consumer. Now let's look into the demand curve. What is a demand curve? A demand curve is one which is shown graphically. Here, when a demand schedule is made use of to draw a curve, we call it as a demand curve. A demand schedule shown graphically is called demand curve, which explains different quantities of a commodity that will be demanded at different prices. So here we have drawn a demand curve. So this curve is drawn based on the previous table, this table. So based on that table, we have drawn the curve. So what does this graph show us? So on the y-axis represents price. The x, that is the horizontal axis, represents the quantity demanded. Now here, what is the shape of the demand curve? The shape of the demand curve is one which is sloping downwards. We say the demand curve has a negative slope. Why do we say that the demand curve has a negative slope? Because there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Whenever there is an inverse relationship between two variables, the curve slopes downward to the right. So here too, we see that the demand curve, this is the demand curve. The demand curve has a negative slope. It slopes downward from left to right, representing the inverse relationship between price and quantity demand. Now, how do we draw the demand curve? Here, at price 20, if you just see, at price 20, the quantity demanded is 1. Similarly, as the price decreases, the quantity demanded increases from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on. So if we join those points, we get a curve known as the demand curve. So next, let's look into the market demand schedule and the market demand curve. Market demand schedule shows the quantities of a particular commodity that will be demanded by all the consumers at all the possible prices at a particular time. This market demand schedule is a tabular statement giving the quantities of a commodity demanded in aggregate by all the buyers or the consumers in the market at all possible prices over a given period of time. A market demand schedule thus represents the total market demand at various prices. Therefore, market demand schedule is defined as the quantities of a given commodity which all consumers will buy at all possible prices at a particular time. Now, how do we derive the market demand from individual demand schedule is illustrated in the following table. If you look at this table, you see that the market demand schedule is constructed by the horizontal additions of quantities at various prices related in individual market schedules. So here we have assumed there are 3 buyers, buyer A, B and C. So we have the demand by buyer A, by buyer B and by buyer C at various possible prices. So if you just look at the table, you see at price 10, A buys 20, B buys 25, C buys 12. At price 12, A buys 18, B buys 24, C buys 11, and so on. Here also, the law of demand holds good. But the quantities demanded may vary. But the law of demand holds good here because as the prices decrease, what happens to the quantity demanded from each buyer? It goes on decreasing. So here too there is an inverse relationship. Market demand schedule only adds up the demand from all the buyers, and in the last column you see there is the market demand, that is the sum total of the demand by A plus B plus C. 20 plus 25 plus 12, you get 57. Similarly, when you add up all this, you get what is called as the market demand. So here remember, the above table assumes that the market is composed of 3 buyers. And this is constructed by the horizontal additions of quantities at various prices related in the individual demand schedules. So here again, once we have the schedule, we can derive the demand curve. Now, based on the schedule, when we plot it on a graph, we get what is called as the market demand curve. Market demand curve is derived by horizontal summation of individual demand curves for a given product. Now, if you look at the figure, that is the market demand curve, what do you see? It illustrates the derivation of market demand curve from individual demand curves. You see in this market demand curve, we have plotted 4 different graphs. The first one is of the individual consumer A, the second is of the individual consumer B, and the third is the individual consumer C. And the last one is the sum total of all the 3, which we call it as the market demand curve. So in this figure, the price of the commodity is measured on the y-axis, the quantity demanded on the x-axis. So this DA, DB and DC, just look at the figures, you will see DA. DA is the demand curve of A consumer, DB of B consumer, DC of C consumer. DM is the market demand curve. So here, when we see OMA is the amount demanded by A, OMB is the amount demanded by B, OMC is the demand by C. So if we total up all this, that is OMA1, OMB1 plus OMC1, you get what is called as the market demand curve. So here we see that the slope of the market demand curve is an average of the slopes of the individual demand curves. In all the 3 cases, A, B, C, the demand curve is sloping downwards. So obviously the market demand also should be sloping downwards. The market demand curve is just the sum of the 3 demand curves. So this is what we mean by the market demand curve. Market demand curve has a downward slope indicating price quantity inverse relationship. I hope it is clear. Individual demand curve is a curve which is drawn based on the price quantity of an individual consumer. What is the quantity demanded at various prices by an individual consumer? Whereas market demand curve is the summation of the individual demand curves. If we assume there are 4 consumers, take all the 4 consumers. If there are 3, take all the 3 consumers. So this is what we call as the market demand curve. So now let's see what are the factors behind this law of demand. When we say factors, why does the demand curve slope downwards to the right? What does the law of demand state? Other things remaining constant, higher the price, lower is the demand. Lower the price, higher is the demand. So there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demand. When there is an inverse relationship, there is always a downward sloping demand curve. So normally a question is asked, why does the demand curve slope downwards to the right? This question means, why do we buy more when the price is less? Or why do we buy less when the price is more? This question implies this reasoning. So there are various factors behind this law of demand as to why the demand curve slopes downwards to the right. And one such factor is the principle of the diminishing marginal utility. That is the law of diminishing marginal utility. We should remember the law of demand is derived from the law of diminishing marginal utility, which we have already discussed. Now, what does this law of diminishing marginal utility tell us? Law of diminishing marginal utility explains that when a consumer consumes more of a commodity, every additional unit of that commodity will give him less and less satisfaction. Hence, he will be ready to purchase more of a commodity only when it is offered to him at lower price. If the price of the product increases, definitely the consumer will restrict its consumption. The consumer will never pay more than the utility that he will get from its consumption. Thus, the quantity demanded for a commodity increases with the fall in price and diminishes with the rise in price. Just because this law of diminishing marginal utility plays a role here. I hope it is clear. Since the additional unit of a commodity gives you lesser satisfaction, a consumer would prefer to buy more when the prices are less. And the next factor as to why the demand curve slopes downward, why is there an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, is explained in terms of income effect. Now, please try to understand this. Here, when the price of a commodity falls, how do we explain this income effect? It's this way. When the price of a commodity falls, other things remaining the same, what happens? The real income of the consumer increases in terms of that commodity. Students, please remember there is a difference between money income and real income. Real income is always expressed in terms of the volume of goods that money can buy. When I say volume of goods that money can buy, depends upon the prices. When the prices are low, you can buy more, because what happens to the real income? The real income increases when prices are low. Always remember, when you have, suppose you have, say, 100 rupees in your hand and a commodity is fetching rupees 10 per unit. Now, that 100 rupees, with that 100 rupees, you could buy 10 units. Now, what has happened to the price? Instead of 10, the price decreases to rupees 5, just for example. Now, how much money do you have? The money you have in hand is 100 rupees. But that same 100 rupees, since the prices have gone down, that same 100 rupees can buy 20 units of that commodity. Earlier, when the price was 10, 100 rupees could buy only 10 units. But now, that same 100 rupees can buy 20 units because the price has gone down. This is what we call as the real income effect. So, this is one of the factors as to why consumers buy more when the price is less and buy less when the price is more. The increase in real income encourages the consumer to buy more. The increase in quantity demanded on account of an increase in real income is the income effect. And the next is the substitution effect. When the price of a commodity falls, prices of its substitutes remaining the same, the commodity whose price has fallen becomes relatively cheaper. Since a utility maximizing consumer substitutes cheaper goods for costlier ones, demand for the cheaper commodity expands. The increase in quantity demanded on account of this factor is known as substitution effect. I hope it is clear. See, most times commodities have substitutes. What are substitutes? Substitutes are those products which can be replaced for one another. Now, suppose the commodity in question, the price of the commodity falls. But what happens to the prices of its substitute? There is no change in the price of the substitutes. So, what happens? You feel that the commodity, suppose X and Y are substitutes, the price of X falls, the price of Y do not change. So what happens? The commodity whose price has fallen, that is X, becomes relatively cheaper. So what happens is that generally consumers would buy more of a cheaper good for costlier ones. That is, the consumer will buy more of X rather than Y. So this increase in quantity demanded on account of this change in the price of one commodity to that of the change in the price of another commodity is known as substitution effect. And the last one, as to why the demand curve slopes downwards to the right. It is for the reason that a commodity may have different uses. If a commodity can be put to several uses, its demand is affected more by a change in its price. If the price of such commodities rises, they are used only for the more important uses. As a result, their demand will contract. On the contrary, when the price falls, the commodity will be put to many uses where it was not being used earlier. This is one of the reasons as to why the demand curve slopes downward. Now, for example, electricity. Electricity can be put to different uses. But when do you use more of electricity? Only when the price of electricity is less. Suppose now in your own homes, what do you see? Electricity can be used for several purposes. You can use to heat water, you can use for geyser, you can use it for AC. So many things electricity can be used. But when the prices of that commodity is on the highest side, you limit the use of the commodity. But when the price of electricity is less, you increase the use of the commodity. So what happens? Higher the price, lower the demand. Lower the price, higher is the demand. Why? Because in this case, that particular commodity can be put to several uses. When do you put that commodity to several uses? When the price of that commodity is cheaper. When the price of that commodity is on the highest side, you limit the use of the commodity for a limited purpose. So these are the reasons or the factors behind the law of demand. Or we can explain why, with these factors, we can explain as to why the demand curve slopes downwards to the right. And in the next class, let's look into the exceptions to the law of demand. Here, when you say exceptions, many a time people behave contrary. Contrary means opposite to what we normally expect according to this law. According to this law of demand, how do people behave? People behave in a way that when the prices increase, they buy less of the commodity. When the prices decrease, they buy more of the commodity. That is the normal law of demand. And we expect people to behave that way. But many a times people do not behave in this way. That's why we say many a time people behave contrary, opposite to what we normally expect according to this law. So when people behave in an opposite way, such behavior we call them as exceptions to this law. So let's discuss these various exceptions in the next class. That's all for now. Thank you.